Last time we left Jacob on the shores of the Jabbok River. He sent ahead all of his servants with gift after wave, trying to appease Esau, because Esau has heard that Jacob's come back to Canaan, and he's on his way with 400 men, and Jacob is trying to show Esau that he's learned his lesson. He's trying to show Esau that he respects him. He's trying to show Esau that he doesn't need to be squashed like a bug. He's trying to work out in his mind how God's plan and promise fit in with the reality that he is seeing, that his brother, who last he heard was bent on killing him, is on his way with what we would consider quite the war band. And so that's where we left Jacob last week, where he's praying to God, but also making his plans for how to mitigate any damage that Esau might do. Questions or comments? Barry, we're in Genesis 32. You're in the wrong end of the Bible.
No, I know. I was going to go to the glossary.
Anything left over from last time? So let's continue with what I think is one of the strangest events in the Old Testament. So, starting at verse 22. He, that is Jacob, got up that night, took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream. He also sent his possessions across. Jacob was left alone, and he wrestled with a man until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he touched the socket of his thigh, and the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated as he wrestled. The man said, "Let me go, it's daybreak." Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Then he said to him, "What is your name?" He said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have fought with God and with men, you've won." Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." He said, "Why do you ask what my name is?" Then he blessed him there. Jacob named the place Peniel, because he had seen God face to face, and my life is spared. The sun rose as he crossed over at Peniel, and he was limping because of his thigh. For that reason, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the tendon of the hip that is on the socket of the thigh, because God touched the socket of Jacob's thigh on the tendon of the hip. So, what are your observations and your questions?
Well, I'm baffled at it. It says, "I have seen God face to face." Well, all through the Bible, you couldn't see God or you're done.
Right?
And it says here, but he saw God.
We also get that from Moses.
He didn't see the whole glory of God because he was in the crevice.
Well, except when he goes in the tent of meeting, we're told Moses spoke with God face to face as a man speaks to his friend.
Mhm.
But then in John 1, we're told, no one has ever seen God, except God, the one and only, has made him known to us, referring to Jesus. So, one of the things we're seeing is Jacob is recognizing with that statement what an unbelievable and remarkable occurrence this was. That God would humble himself to come down and be on the shores of the Jabbok River with him and not just strike Jacob down. So, Jacob can at one hand say that I saw God. But it's also very clear that God humbles himself to reveal himself to Jacob in a way that Jacob is not consumed by God's holiness, but he's spared by God's mercy.
Why don't we have the answer to God's question?
What is God's question?
Why do you ask my name?
What is the answer to that question?
I know. We don't need to know the answer.
I am.
Say it again louder, Gene.
Jacob knew that that was God.
Jacob already knew the name. Now, Moses again asks, what is your name? What am I supposed to tell the Israelites? And God says, I am who I am. I am the God of Jacob. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Abraham. I said those in reverse order. I don't know why. And so, it's not like Jacob had the fullest understanding of God and his name and everything that it meant. But the Lord had revealed himself to Abraham using the name that we say is God's name, Yahweh, or, the God who always is, that God of grace and favor. And so God's saying, you don't need to know my name. Why are you asking a question to which you already know the answer? Is kind of the way I would say. What other observations do you have? Did you have a question? It was already asked. Oh.
Did he send his wife and sons over and take time to see what happened?
So,
It's lacking in detail, but how do you just start wrestling yeah, they ran out of the woods and tackled him. There you go.
So, why did he send his family across first? Well, there's a tactical answer to that question.
Impending conflict with Esau's men.
Right. Where's the last place you want your enemy to fall upon you? When you're knee deep in a river. Because you're easy pickings then. Because they can move and shoot, and you are just, try running in water. It doesn't work. So he wants to make sure that his family is across, because also, crossing one person over a river, it's only going to take a little while. crossing over all of his whole family. Granted, some of the sons are at least close to adulthood, you know. But Joseph's probably still a child. Some of the others might be in their teens. But, you know, let's get all of this over and set. So that's the tactical reason why he sends his family over first, so that that's done. They're already out of the danger zone, so to speak. If they need to run and flee, they can go off to the sides. They're not stuck in the river. Why does he stay behind?
Rear guard.
What's that?
Rear guard.
He could be thinking he's the rear guard. I think he probably has something else in mind. Time to think. Time to spend more hours in prayer. Why not do that in his own tent? He wants the time alone. And so this is also a way for him to preserve his own time to be alone and set. And he can be away from it all. And, you know, sometimes that's also true, that even being in a house with everybody sleeping is not the same as being out, away from everything else, away from all concerns. There's nothing that can possibly distract him. There's nothing left for him to do. All he has left to do is to pray to God. And while he's doing that, you're right, we lack details here. Go ahead, Gene.
Again, we lack details, but we're not, we're trying to imagine how the conflict, how the wrestling started. Was there an aggressor, defensive, and I just,
Well, it would appear to me that God is the one who's the aggressor.
for the purpose of testing,
Ah,
to give him a chance to get the name of Israel.
so that is kind of the big question. Why does God do this? And what are we supposed to do with that information?
At any time, God wrestling with Jacob could have wiped him off the face of the earth, could have easily defeated him after an hour. I think he was showing Jacob his mercy.
Okay. What other comments do we have on the Lord wrestling with Jacob? Just that before we get on to the whole naming and all of that. What is God doing and why? Or what questions do you still have about it?
Jacob is worried about his meeting with Esau.
Okay?
What if God lets him wrestle with him and he doesn't die? Then to showing Jacob, I have a plan.
Okay? In some ways, it's also along those lines. Jacob, your life is never more in danger than it was the night before. You think Esau is scary to face. The Almighty God wrestled with you. Joel, you look like you had a question.
Just note, Jacob acknowledging God as a source of blessing. Just wondering, throughout his life, was he acknowledging God as a blessing? Being blessed by God throughout his life?
So,
This happened?
we kind of talked about that last week. If you go to when Jacob decides he needs to leave Laban's house,
Right.
he talks about how the Lord blessed him no matter what. And then also in his prayer, I am not even worthy a bit of all the mercy and all the faithfulness you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan River with just my staff, and now I have grown into 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid that it will come strike. You said, I will surely do good to you and make your descendants like the grains of the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because... So, although Jacob seems like a conniver,
Seems.
and certainly it's clear that he is blessed with cleverness and a hard work ethic and all the things that would lead to success from an earthly perspective. At the same time, Jacob recognized that's not enough. And as long as we're on that point, that's worth for us to recognize too. Very easy to take credit for all of our good decisions. And see, everything I have is because I've made such good decisions. And as people of faith, we don't say, well, I caught a lucky break here and there, or, things fell the right way, but we recognize that God's hand has been there. And it's only by his mercy that even my skill and my gifts and my good decisions meet with blessing, and often more blessing than they deserve. So, as Job would once profess, we accept good from the hand of God, just as we accept evil. Go ahead, Gene.
Is there any further other than the reference to the animal, to the other sacrifices, the remembrance of this socket and the ligaments and stuff? Is there any reference in the rest of Israel, Jacob's lifetime, referring back to this? I mean, this experience obviously affected him.
No, there's not.
Okay.
One of the things I don't have a full answer to, but I pay attention to, is when in poetry, so in Psalms and prophecy, when God calls his people Jacob, heel grabber, or sons of Jacob, and when God calls his people Israel. And I think it's just worth taking a moment to pause, especially when those two are side by side, and ponder the two differences in the names. And now, in poetry, Hebrew poetry, you say the same thing twice in different ways. That's the way their poetry works. So just like we like to rhyme, they like to repeat things. but with different words, so that you think about it in a deeper way. But I think when we see Jacob and Israel side by side, part of that getting you to think about it in a deeper way is to consider the origin of each of those names and what it says about the person and what it says about God and what it says about the relationship between God and his people. That God calls the heel grabber, but God turns him into Israel. Oh, I'm going to have to hurry up. So, if we assume, and I think we have to assume, that in a way God attacks Jacob, and at some point Jacob comes to the realization, this is a strange wrestling match. Because this man that I'm wrestling with, maybe he had plenty of opportunities to overcome, even kill Jacob, and didn't take them. And yet he never let Jacob go. And so in the end, Jacob says, I'm just going to hold on for all I'm worth and struggle and strive. And so Jacob at some point in time seems to realize there's something different, something special about this, because he calls out, let me go, and Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. So that seems to me to say that there's some recognition on Jacob's part that this wrestler is from God. Now, we often hear of Jacob wrestling with God as if, well, we need to wrestle with God. Have you ever heard that application? That we need to wrestle with God, and people talk about wrestling with God in prayer. I don't know that maybe I used it.
I just started finding words.
Well, then I turn to Romans 8, where the Holy Spirit listens to the prayers of our hearts that we can only moan and groan about. He turns our pain to grunts into real prayers. But in this, who is the one who initiates the wrestling? God. And so I don't know that it's right to say, well, you have to wrestle with God and demand your blessing, but rather to recognize that sometimes God wrestles with us.
Takes us by the shoulder and shakes.
He forces us to struggle against him in a way. One of the pictures I like for this, when you consider the disparity here, Jacob versus God. If I wrestle with a 5-year-old, is that 5-year-old ever going to beat me?
Years later.
Maybe.
Maybe temporary.
So it's funny. My old wrestling coach, he's now down in Medford. He came here once. But he had to be older than I am now. Somewhere around there. He was probably in his late 40s, early 50s. And he would sometimes wrestle with us. And it was strange that he was very difficult to beat. Like, it seemed like we're in the prime condition. Then again, we also had been doing conditioning drills for the last 2 hours, and he was fresh. But, you know, it takes a long time for a young person to have the strength, stamina to beat a fully grown adult. But I think of it, because we're not talking about a 16-year-old versus a 40-year-old. We're talking about when you're comparing Jacob to God, you are probably talking about a 5-year-old versus an Olympic wrestler. And yet, why would an Olympic wrestler then wrestle with a 5-year-old? For his own benefit? But for the 5-year-old's benefit. Dads are supposed to roughhouse with their children because that's how children learn how to manipulate and control their bodies. That's how they learn to continue and not give up. That's how they learn how to do things and live, and they learn perseverance. And so we wrestle with, we play with our children, we fight against our children, even if we're not going to let them win, so to speak. We maybe hold back our full strength because that's how those children grow. And when I read this, I'm also remembering Isaiah 45, verse 15. Surely you are a God who hides himself. Sometimes God is hiding in our struggles, in our pain, in our suffering. And he's forcing us to contend with he himself. But for what purpose? What's the end result of Jacob's wrestling? I think that's why it's important that that memorial of not eating the tendon remains. Because every time the Israelites said, well, we don't eat that tendon, we don't eat that meat attached there to the hip socket, they were remembering that God contends with them for their blessing. So every struggle of a believer's life is for the believer's good. That's where we have to leave it, because we're already far over time. But if we have leftovers, we can bring that back next week.
Just a yes or a no,
Maybe.
and then I'll bring it up next